What's happening, hardscapers? This is episode 46 of the How to Hardscape podcast, where we talk to you about how you can start and grow your hardscaping business. And today we're joined by Paul Hewgill of Tensar and Ray Rodenburgh of Unilock to talk about TriAx Geogrid, or DriveGrid, to stabilize your bases in driveway and patio applications, and how it is a solid, cheap insurance to be quoting into your job. So without further ado, here's our interview with Paul and Ray. Today, we're joined by Paul Hewgill of Tensar and Ray Rodenburgh of Unilock. Ray was an early guest on the show talking about the Unilift, the U-Level, and U-Vision, and Paul is the Senior Regional Sales Manager for Tensar, and they're both here to talk with us about TriAx Geogrid, DriveGrid in your installs. Paul, Ray, thank you so much for both joining me here today.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Paul, let's just get started here and get to know a little bit more about yourself, your background in the industry, and then maybe we can learn a little bit more about Tensar and what they do.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. My background is civil engineering, and I started working for first a geotech company out of school, and then I worked for Terrafix for quite a few years of my career in technical sales. And that exposed me to a lot of products, geotextiles, and also Tensar Geogrids. And then I've been now working for Tensar for about 7.5 years in this role.
Awesome. And then what does Tensar specialize in for those that may not have heard the company name before?
Yeah, great. Tensar came into North America in the early 80s, brought a manufacturing technology for geogrids, and opened up in Atlanta. From that plant that's still there today, we service all of the Western Hemisphere. And so we specialize in manufacturing of geogrids for earth reinforcement, for aggregate stabilization. So we get involved in, heavy infrastructure projects, and the same technology gets used certainly in the landscape industry as well.
Absolutely, which is perfect to have you on the show to talk a little bit more about this. And Ray, obviously Unilock has partnered with Tensar to create DriveGrid. Can you talk with us about why Unilock did that, partnered with Tensar?
So we started noticing several years back that there was an interest in aggregate stabilization and strengthening for the purpose of increasing the longevity of hardscape projects. And we looked at several different products, and there are several good products out there, but we wanted to partner with a company that had the experience, the background engineering, product supply, and a product that frankly wasn't going to break the bank for our contractors. I mean, to add $2 a square foot to a project, we just couldn't see past doing something like that. So we looked at Tensar, and they brought us the TriAx Geogrid, which we've branded as DriveGrid for our business, and really happy with that relationship.
Amazing. And Paul, getting into the thick of things now, what are geogrids? Can you talk to us about what geogrids are? How do they work? What they're made of? Anything in specific that you want to cover?
Yeah, for sure. So geogrids essentially are made from plastic. They have openings or apertures, as we call them, so that aggregate can lock into or at least interact, depending on what application you're using it for. So in some applications, like in retaining walls, they will literally reinforce the soil behind the wall. And then in applications such as roads and driveways, the apertures will allow the aggregate to lock in, so that we can stabilize an aggregate layer within a pavement structure, such as below pavers, and allow that section to perform much better and perform for a longer period of time.
Gotcha. And then I've heard of uniaxial, I've heard of biaxial. What is triaxial? How does it differ from these other two?
Yeah, good question. So we brought the biaxial and the uniaxial to the marketplace in the early 80s. And then 12 years ago, we brought the TriAx Geogrid, which represents improved performance over biaxial geogrids. So essentially, we've changed the geometry. It's triangles, it's hexagons, and changed the structure of the ribs so that we get better interlock with the aggregate, better stabilization, faster compaction, than compared with our biaxial geogrids.
Okay, so we've got this triaxial geogrid. Where is it going in terms of our installation? Like, in what step and in what layer are we putting this triaxial?
Yeah, great question. A lot of the applications we have done and still do today, and where people think about geogrids, is typically soft soils. So if you're dealing with a soft soil situation and you want to minimize how much of that soil you have to remove to get a stable base, a geogrid can certainly help. So in those cases, I would put it at the bottom, with or without a fabric. We can talk a bit more about that as well. But the geogrid at the bottom in that case, because you're placing it like it was a snowshoe. So the stiffness of the geogrid is going to help you to spread load over a wider area, and it will act literally like a snowshoe and allow you to have a stable base create a stable base to build up from as you get to the top of your structure to your pavers. So one of the answers is put it at the bottom when you're dealing with soft soil. The other answer could be you could potentially move that up a little bit higher in the structure if the approach that you are taking as a contractor is to have greater stiffness of the aggregate closer to the bottom side of the paver. In that case, I would say bring it up to within 6 inches of the bottom side of the paver, and you could really stiffen up that layer beneath the surface.
Gotcha. So in that second application, basically, would that be underneath our 1-inch bedding layer, or would that be literally on top of that bedding layer, right underneath those pavers?
Well, we typically need about we need a minimum of 6 inches of any kind of stone or material on top of the geogrid just to be able to place it. I've seen it done with 4 inches, and I think it is possible to do it if the contractor is being cautious with equipment and such, but we typically say 6 inches minimum cover. So it's going to be certainly below your bedding layer as well as below some aggregate layer.
Perfect. And when it comes to, you mentioned the geotextile being used with this triaxial geogrid in some applications. Can you explain a little bit more about that and how this geogrid would act as a soil separator as a fabric would?
Fabrics are still used today and used successfully, and their function, as you say, is primarily a separator. They can potentially stabilize to some extent or reinforce if they're forced into tension. In other words, if there's enough rutting or settlement as they're being installed that they go into tension, then they're going to provide some degree of reinforcement. But for the most part, they're going to be a separation layer, and that's still valid. It's still, though, then a question of how much thickness of aggregate do you need on a fabric to have enough for that structure. So with a geogrid, we can separate, but not to the same degree of if you need a filter. In other words, if you need to stop fine particles of silt from migrating up, and that typically happens if you have high silt content in your subgrade soil and maybe a little bit too much moisture or water in your subgrade soil as well, that with repeated traffic over there, you may have those fines migrate up. And if there's a concern that is the case, then I always say, go ahead and put a fabric under the grid. Now, I would put a non-woven fabric under the grid, like a 4-ounce non-woven fabric, which is more like the felt type material, under the grid. So the fabric is going to stop the fines from coming up if that's an issue. And then the grid is there next and in contact with the aggregate up above.
Paul, and I've always been curious about this, and I know you've talked a bit about putting that filter fabric down initially if you're in a super wet or moist location with lots of silt and fines, etc. And then you mentioned putting the DriveGrid right over that. Do you find, though, that you get sufficient strike through? You've talked about strike through. You might want to explain that. You've talked about strike. Do you get enough strike through when you got a filter fabric under it?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ray. Strike through is obviously the aggregate just pushing into the apertures. That allows us to have confinement of the aggregate layer and stabilization, as I talked about before. For sure, we still get strike through happening even with a non-woven fabric there. And that's another reason why I would prefer a non-woven in if you're going to combine the two together, because a non-woven is easily stretched. It will conform to the soil that's below it, and it will certainly easily be stretched by any pushing of the aggregate into the aperture of the grid. So we can successfully still stabilize aggregate layers even with that non-woven fabric if it's needed below the geogrid without a problem. And again, the long-term benefit is going to be keeping those fines in place, again, if that's an issue with the soil, for the long-term performance of the structure.
Gotcha. So what I'm understanding is if we're dealing with, say, a more sandy soil, we might want to put a non-woven 4-ounce fabric to separate that from our aggregate base. With that fabric, we can put our TriAx Geogrid right on top of it and create our base from there. But if we're dealing with more of a clay subsoil, we're okay to maybe put our TriAx Geogrid on top of that and build our base up from there.
Yep, absolutely.
Perfect. And is this, so we talked about different soil types, dealing with different soil types. What about aggregates? Like, can we talk a little bit more about what aggregates are going to work better in combination with this DriveGrid?
Yeah, for sure. In general, well-graded angular stone is excellent for structure and also excellent for interlocking with the geogrid. So quite often, 19 millimeter or 3/4 inch crushed material is great. You can sometimes go to a larger size aggregate than that and still have good interlock with the DriveGrid. And in some cases, if clear stone is being used for drainage, as much as clear stone can kind of shift and move around, the geogrid actually helps to keep it in place, at least closer to where the geogrid is located within the structure. It can certainly have that impact on clear stone.
Now, is this a solution for every situation? And what I mean by that is, every job site's different and every project is different. Is this something that basically we can go ahead and apply to every job that we're going to come across? Or are there certain situations where maybe we won't want to go this direction based on maybe the subsoil, maybe the aggregates being used, or maybe just the situation that we find ourselves in on the job site?
I would say on any project where you are using an aggregate layer to create a stable base for something, a geogrid will make that base better in terms of on the short term, during construction, for compaction, and then for the long-term performance. So whether or not I work for a company that manufactures geogrid, I know that just to be true, period. Now the question would be economics, and maybe some other factors, but for sure we can reduce the thickness of aggregate base layers by incorporating mechanical stabilization with a geogrid. We can make those structures last longer. So whether it's just added insurance, for the contractor to the owner to say, look, this is, I'm not going to need to come back to fix this, or whether it's cost savings for, all of the parties involved. There's just a lot of good reasons to consider adding a geogrid to an aggregate base layer.
Now, Ray, what I'm hearing is, and what I've heard in this industry these past couple of years, is that this is cheap insurance. This is a great way for hardscapers to stand out above their competition that maybe aren't doing this. This is a great way to, put a little bit of more money into the project to make sure that it's not going to move over time. Ray, what do you hear in the field? And for hardscapers, what are they experiencing out in the field with DriveGrid?
Contractors have been looking for, as I mentioned earlier, looking for that insurance just to make their projects more stable. And DriveGrid allows that at very little additional expense, ranging anywhere from 30 to 45 cents a square foot. And you look at that on a job that's getting charged $20 a square foot, it's actually very minimal additional cost, yet the benefit is huge. There are contractors even who want to create what I call a super driveway or a super patio, and they'll put in like one layer of DriveGrid on the bottom over the soils. Then they'll add 6 inches of gravel, and then put another layer of DriveGrid on, and then add another 6 inches of gravel on top of that, and then lay their pavers. And because they want to create this ironclad driveway or installation that's never going to give them any kind of grief. So it's definitely the expression cheap insurance is appropriate here.
Now, what sizes does this product come in? And in terms of installation, are we trying to cover as much area as possible with that, whatever size it comes in? Do we overlap? How does this all work?
So the DriveGrid's available in 13 foot wide rolls by 100 feet long. And the rationale behind that was that, if you have a double car wide driveway, typically they're not any wider than 26 feet. And most often they're like 22, 23 feet wide. So with 12 inches of overlap, a roll can nicely go down, do the typical, what I call 1,000 to 1,200 square foot driveway. So it's kind of like the perfect size, one roll. Some guys, just from a handling point of view, putting it in their trucks, will take their masonry saw and cut the roll in half. So they got 2 6.5 foot rolls and take that. They've got a little more overlap when they're using in a driveway situation. On a patio situation, you don't need that much overlap. So it's a very size appropriate type roll.
Now we've covered overlap, and we've talked a little bit about the minimum amount of aggregate that you need to be able to separate, say, 2 layers of DriveGrid, or between the DriveGrid and the pavers. Is there a maximum amount of aggregate that we can use to separate 2 different layers of DriveGrid, or the DriveGrid between the pavers?
If you are in an application where you want to use 2 layers, and that does typically happen if you've got soft soil, so you want one at the bottom, then you want a second layer to help effect the aggregate right up to the underside of the pavers, then I would say once you get beyond 12 to 14 inches of stone, the confinement effect of the geogrid is not being felt as much by the stone in those upper inches. So definitely that would be a time when you might want to consider a second layer. It doesn't mean that you have to have a second layer. That would be a function of the overall design of your structure and whether there's a lot of stabilization that needs to happen in a thicker section. But I would say that would be a good guideline for considering a second layer.
For sure. And then circling back to this overlap, I know I've heard that with whether we're using uniaxial or biaxial in our retaining walls, we should never overlap that geogrid. Now, why with DriveGrid can we overlap in a driveway application or in a patio application?
Yeah, for sure. Well, in retaining walls, the strength of the geogrid is only being utilized in the one direction back from the face of the wall, perpendicular to the length of the wall. So that's why you don't need an overlap there. But in a road or a parking lot or application like that, we're trying to mobilize the stresses from traffic loading in every direction. So imagine a truck drives across it. The aggregate's trying to move away from that wheel load in every direction, literally in a circle almost, away from that load. That's why this hexagon shape that we now have within the TriAx grid structure is better than we had before with the squares of the biaxial geogrid. And so now we can confine that aggregate in every direction. So you've got those stresses in every direction. So we need coverage in every direction, and that's why we need the overlap.
Ray, you talked about this ironclad driveway going DriveGrid 6 inches of aggregate, DriveGrid 6 inches of aggregate, screed pavers. What is the minimum amount of excavation that we can do with DriveGrid? I mean, how can this save us, say, time, money, efficiency on a job site? Can you speak a little bit about that? Because I know, especially with a shortened season that we find ourselves in due to this COVID-19 situation, I'm sure everybody's looking for ways to get through as many projects as possible to become more efficient.
DriveGrid allows you to definitely reduce the base somewhat, but it's really dependent on what some of the soils are like. We actually have a little small postcard like instruction that kind of in a sort of ad hoc field type way, you can kind of test what kind of subsoil you have. Provided you've removed all the topsoil and organic materials, you can typically, save about 30% in your aggregates. So that means not only saving the aggregates, you're saving the excavation time and any tipping fees related to the fill that you've taken out. So, but again, it's soil dependent. There are some soils which are like your well-drained, sandy type soils. Those probably you could even save 50% of the aggregate that's needed. So it's very dependent on the subsoils, but definitely in the area of 30 to 35% is not uncommon.
Incredible. And kind of wrapping this up, Ray, you talked a little bit about cost per square foot for this DriveGrid. How is this comparing to other geotextile fabrics and other grids on the market? Is TriAx going to be on the upper end of the different geogrids and on the upper end of these fabrics in terms of cost?
Actually, it's more or less the opposite. Other aggregate stabilizing products out there tend to be even 5 or 6 times the price of what DriveGrid is. So it's interesting that DriveGrid at such a reasonable cost can provide such a tremendous strength. And that's what initially attracted us to the Tensar product, because we knew it had the engineering background. They're a worldwide organization. They do their due diligence. Their product is used for highway building, road building, parking lot building. It's used a lot. We really felt that with that kind of background in engineering, that this is the product that the contractors should be using.
Paul, I'm sure you've seen lots of different applications of this GeoGrid. What are some of the most extreme projects that you've found this GeoGrid saving the day on a project?
Yeah, over my my years of experience, I've been on job sites where GeoGrid was used to build a road over a swamp, and it's pretty amazing, pretty dramatic to see to yourself, sink down to your knees in muck, and then see a contractor place GeoGrid 2 to 3 feet of aggregate fill and build a road over top of a swamp. And of course, you get consolidation of the peat soils, and the water drains out eventually, and you get a stronger structure. But it doesn't happen without the GeoGrid there acting like a big snowshoe. So I've seen that done numerous times, and it's amazing, and it's really exciting technology.
Absolutely. And as we close out this interview, Paul, Ray, is there anything that you'd want to highlight one more time about DriveGrid, about the application of DriveGrid, in terms of how this is something that contractors should be looking into, should be starting to implement this season in their base preparations?
Well, I think every contractor should use DriveGrid to stabilize their jobs and reduce excavation costs. And I think it's also a great selling feature, to be able to tell the homeowner. You mentioned it earlier, Mike, that if you knew your sales pitch and you talk about how you build the ironclad driveway or how you strengthen the base and with a product that has been engineered and is used around the world for building roads, I think you've got a very poignant sales point that you can drive home with your client in the sales process.
Yeah, and I just like to highlight that one more time, that it's even a good idea to bring a piece of this with you to show the customer, because a lot of the times when you're when you're talking technical with them, it just goes right over their head. And if it's difficult to explain, it's like a mesh type fabric. Whereas you can just bring a piece with you, show it to them, and explain to them how this is going to disperse the load.
Unilock has some great resources on their website, including a couple of videos, and the sample in the hand of the sales guy is a great idea to show them the thing, throw it to them physically, but also to direct them to Unilock's website where they can see demonstrations of how the grid works.
Paul, you and I did an interview a couple of years ago on an actual driveway, and we posted that video on YouTube. So anybody want to learn a little extra on DriveGrid can certainly look that video up on YouTube or via our website under the UTech resources area.
Paul, where can we learn a little bit more about Tensar?
I would say our website, tensarcorp.com, is a great place to get a good idea of what we do in terms of the depth of infrastructure projects that we get involved with. We have a lot of resources there, a lot of pre-recorded webinars that are great education tools, of course, literature, resources, and support documents. So I mean that's a great way to learn more about our company. And then of course people can easily from there be directed towards regional sales managers and other people that are in the field.
And then closing down this interview, Ray, can you explain where we can get our hands on DriveGrid if we're a contractor?
If contractors looking for DriveGrid, they can visit any one of our 550 dealers across North America. Most of them will be carrying DriveGrid, and those that can hold the inventory will certainly have it. And best thing is just to give them a call and see it's available and how soon they can get it.
Ray, Paul, thank you so much for joining me here today.
My pleasure.
Hey, Mike, it was a pleasure being on your show.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast episode. Visit us at howtohardscape.com for more information on this subject. Let us know what you want to learn about in future episodes by reaching out to us on our social channels. We are at howtohardscape on Facebook and Instagram. And email us at contact@howtohardscape.com. We'd love it if you subscribe to this podcast, left us a rating and review. Again, this really helps us get this podcast out there into other people's ears and to attract some more great guests onto the show to deliver you more value. We look forward to meeting with you next week on the How to Hardscape podcast.